Welcome to another episode of Gamers, Developers, and Scholars. I'm your host, Javier, and joining me today are...
Hey, I'm Charles.
Hi, I'm in Ladyem.
Hi, I'm Poppy.
And we continue our conversation, this time with spoilers unleashed. We had our initial remarks about this wonderful game, but now, fortunately, we have all reached a point where there's been an actual murder. And we also heard last time that while we have enjoyed this game, Imre mentioned to us that the team originally had something very different in mind. Originally, this game was going to be pixel art. So, because of limited resources, they changed the game into what it is today. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what do you think, guys, of limited resources compromising the original vision for a game?
It's something that the industry's had to deal with basically from the beginning, and I think that it can result in some really awesome stuff. Like one of the things that I've talked a lot before about is there's this impulse, I think, especially with modern gaming, to make everything realistic. And the reality is a good, well-realized artistic style is going to always hold up better. Even though it's a Super Nintendo game, the example I always point to is Yoshi's Island. There is nobody who will look at that game and say, oh, that's an ugly game, it's so old. No, it looks beautiful because it looks like crayon art, and it's awesome. And there are plenty of other examples of like full 3D games that have a good sort of art style that overcomes those limitations. And sometimes limitations become a part of the game. Like, Javier, we've talked a lot during the development thing about how Resident Evil and Silent Hill overcame their technical limitations by using fixed camera angles, by using pre-rendered backgrounds, and sort of how they were able to make things feel a lot bigger and more cinematic than, with the limited resources of the PlayStation, and even more so whenever they ported things over to the N64.
You're referring, Charles, to the references for our own game, right?
Yeah.
Charles has been, as one of our players, been very interesting to hear his feedback. Mm-hmm. So for you, Charles, you mentioned that it is not necessary to pour in more pixels, as many games try to do with these excellent examples. I'm not sure if you guys and Poppy, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, often I'm really struck by games who do something different like this. Like, this is not something that I typically see with like the human bodies and the animal heads. This is not something that you really see in games all that often. You more often will see the things like the hyper-realistic type of art style. And I think that what Charles is saying is completely accurate, is that a lot of the games that have really stuck with me are games that are very, very stylized. Like, I'm thinking in particular Wind Waker. Like, Wind Waker is still a beautiful game. Wind Waker is absolutely gorgeous. And a lot of that was, limitations on the GameCube, but it's still a very, very pretty game, and way prettier, in my opinion, and I know people argue this with me, way prettier than what Twilight Princess ended up being. Because Twilight Princess ended up being very brown and very, like, realistic-ish.
Yeah.
And it just did not age as well. Like, it's not as pretty to look at now. And I continuously go back to Wind Waker because it's beautiful. And then Twilight Princess is like, I like the game, it's fine, but I really don't want to spend more time with it. But I think that generally many games on Nintendo consoles always have to have a little bit of a limitation, and that was a good example of that.
Absolutely. I believe Nintendo seizes a lot their constraints, and that's why their hardware, their games, don't try to push the realistic ceiling that many other colleagues do. Very quickly, from the developer standpoint, we constantly have to pitch to people who will fund our games, and these people, sometimes the very first barrier that they evaluate games is how well does it look. For the longest time, many people who made the decisions about funding were not actual players. So you guys are very informed about how there are more things than just looking better and better every time. So that's why many games in our industry for the longest time were pushing and pushing and pushing this barrier, even though possibly yourself, players, experts, and ourselves, developers, were aware that there was more to it than more pixels. In that sense, Poppy, I thought during the week about something that you mentioned. You said that in your paper of the Empathic Gamer, that when players empathize with characters, they experience what in this case chickens are living. However, you also mentioned on our last episode that for you it was potentially a missed opportunity to have our characters as anthropomorphized characters instead of actual animals. So what is the net result, do you think, about the level of empathy that we feel for these characters?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Javier, and something that I've been kind of musing as well more as I've kind of played the game more. And I think, as I say, I think the characters are all great. I think that's the kind of first thing to say. I think that they're really strong characters. I think you get a real sense of each of the characters, and as I said last time, I think that the voice actors do a great job in that. The kind of body language movements, even as minimal as they are used to great effect in terms of conveying different emotions, and so I think the level of characterization is actually really strong. That said, I still think that not a lot of that is because of the gamer, because the gamer has less agency in terms of what we can do in the game and how we can build that kind of characterization. So I think the way that we kind of connect with Sunny is more, I guess, more from a kind of third person perspective than really necessarily, like, for example, I don't really feel myself as Sunny in this game, and there's other games where your kind of connection with the avatar makes it feel much more strongly that you're kind of entrenched within the development of their character, the choices that they have going forwards, which I think in certain ways can heighten empathic feelings. So I think we don't have that as much in this game because, like I say, of the way that it is more that kind of narrative aspect. We're not in charge of so many choices, but I think we do still feel a kind of empathy for Sunny as a character, kind of being down on his luck, as it were. Especially, I thought that what struck me probably in chapter 2 is when Marty's really having a go at Sunny, and you're there on the burning ship, and Marty's like, you knew I wouldn't leave you. You got me involved in this, and now here we are. And I think also that's something that the game does really. It has a really interesting thing that it starts, really kind of at the end of the Chicken Police's relationship. We've got this whole backstory, this whole world, this whole history of them having been this duo who were famous and well known, and we're then entering that world kind of halfway through, and I think, as I say, that kind of enhances that sense of those characters as well.
Interesting. Go ahead, Charles.
Well, because to kind of like, you were talking about the empathy and kind of like how we're not really taking on the role of Sunny, we're more just observing. Like, that's I don't know that that's necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's something that I've noticed a lot with RPGs. When you have Western RPGs, the emphasis is oftentimes very much on creating an avatar that you then take through this journey. Whereas if you go and play something like a JRPG, oftentimes, if there is any customization, it's minimal, and the idea is you're playing this character's story. And I think that's always been a weird sort of dilemma for games, is how much do you want your player to project onto the character versus how much do you want your player to be that character? And I think what we're seeing is a lot more games kind of playing with that. And the idea that in many ways the player avatar doesn't matter as much as I think a lot of people want it to. The prime example is Thomas Was Alone, where you are playing literally as a rectangle, and that's it. And you still project onto Thomas, and you still, like, it's all about Thomas's journey. And so I really like the visual style of Chicken Police because it adheres to an old cartoon rule, which is the most important thing is not your character's design. It's that if you see them in complete silhouette,
the silhouette
you can immediately identify them. Yeah. And you can tell all your characters apart. And I think that works really well for Chicken Police, because we also talked a little bit about Sam and Max last time, and it goes for the full anthropomorphic animal thing, and it also works. But I think Chicken Police does a weird thing where I can take it more seriously than Sam and Max, even though Sam and Max, I think, has a more consistent visual style.
Interesting. Yeah. I'd love to hear a bit about why can you take more seriously this game, even though we have people, have human, have animal heads. I'd like to hear that, Charles.
So, from a basic stylistic standpoint, what you're essentially getting with Chicken Police is people, but the head of the animal, in many cases, kind of reflects an aspect of their personality. And so, what you're getting with the animal is, in some cases, it's deep, in some cases, it's not, but you're getting a kind of window into who that character is. Whereas if you go too cartoony, with Sam and Max, there's not really any reason he has to be a giant dog that looks weird and cartoony. And it's hard for me to take that seriously because everything else is rendered in a not realistic style. But you're walking around and you just have normal people, and then randomly there will be a dog and a rabbit and a chicken in the room. And I feel like that lends itself more... in a weird way, it's almost more surreal because you don't have that grounding agent of basically the characters from the neck down. You're engaging in interactions that are completely unfamiliar, whereas with Chicken Police, everything you're seeing is familiar. The people just have animal heads.
Yeah. And in that sense, I believe this juxtaposition, and I believe also some elements like the plot is actually something quite serious. There's been a murder for someone I believe our character can relate to, our player can relate to. In that sense, I recall a lot, and we have discussed in other episodes, when I met Anne, that she presented her book with De Gruyter. She said about something curious, that games, although they can have this very powerful personal impact, very emotional impact, and as an industry they are huge, sometimes there is not that much of an impact outside of our game industry. I believe, and you mentioned, or your experts mentioned, that if a politician says, I have never read a book, it's suicide. But if they say, I have never played a game, nothing happens. In that way, I appreciate something that is happening here on Chicken Police, because I believe that this limitation of mechanics, like Poppy was describing, this level of juxtaposition that you mentioned, Charles, allows people who may not be hardcore gamers to more easily access this, understand this, and appreciate this. I constantly have this in mind because naturally as a developer I care about the audience, but also because my girlfriend is not a player. So there are many games that I say, oh, they're very cool, try them, and because I believe the empathy and the mechanics are way too intense, she immediately gets overwhelmed. And in contrast, I believe with this game, maybe I'll do the experiment, I could give her the controller and she could not feel maybe as overwhelmed because the game doesn't ask that much. And also these elements, these visual elements, allow some familiarity. It's serious, but with a small degree of funny remarks with the head. I'm not sure. Go ahead, Charles.
I was going to say, in the indie gaming space, I feel like that there's a lot of room for a game like this that doesn't necessarily take itself too seriously. It's not necessarily trying to say anything particularly deep. This is a noir story everyone has seen, everyone's heard, everyone's familiar with, and I think that's perfectly fine. One of the games I've talked about with my friends before is Pagan Autogeny, which is this weird, abstract, first-person shooter, immersive sim thing that's a metaphor for gender identity and stuff like that, and it's a really cool game. It's the type of thing that I feel like if you just hand it to players, they might feel alienated or they wouldn't necessarily get. But I think that there's also kind of an artistic space within indie game development that looks down on stuff that is familiar. And I think it's okay for this stuff to exist because it can get people interested and involved in a way that I think games which might potentially say more or be more important in their messaging might not get people into,
I think as well, the fact of what the Chicken Police does, it does very well. It's not like it has limitations, and it's a particular style, but it works within its style very well. So I think, as you say, you know, the things that make it kind of distinct in terms of maybe, as I say, kind of less player agency, less kind of character building through the avatar gamer relationship, more of the, you know, kind of point and click style stuff. That's, as you say, that's not a negative, right? It just means it's a particular type of game, but it does all of those things so well. And as I mentioned last time, you know, everything from the voice actors, the aesthetics, the soundtrack, everything is well thought out and belongs there. You know, there's nothing superfluous in Chicken Police. So I think it's interesting, isn't it? When you talk about a game having limitations, it kind of sounds like you're saying that's a negative thing, but actually, as you say, it really works well with what it does.
Well, the thing is, like, we can talk about limitations in the gameplay, but honestly, it's a visual novel. It's a visual novel point and click hybrid, and that's perfectly fine and perfectly valid. I mean, you know, these are genres that have existed for decades. You know, they're some of the earliest. Like, again, to go back to Japanese media, you see it, I think, a lot more within that sphere on personal computers and stuff like that. And, you know, to this day, I feel like visual novels are largely sort of dominated by a more Japanese aesthetic and style. But, I mean, visual novels they're a completely valid genre. And like I said, I don't know that it's necessarily a limitation on the player so much as it is just a different means of interaction. You know. And
I think actually what's quite interesting is I think the developers are considering making actual graphic novels for Chicken Police as a kind of follow-up to the games. They've got some stuff in the works, so it'll be really interesting to see how they kind of use that as well in terms of those kind of intertextual references, because obviously in the game you pick up the different collectibles, don't you, of the, you know, the stories of the Chicken Police. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about those as that kind of transmedia storytelling will be really interesting to see if they develop the world in that way, where you get different elements of the story through different mediums. So that'll be really interesting to kind of keep an eye on.
Go ahead.
I'm really pulling.
I believe Anne wanted to say something.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, I'm someone who plays a lot of like adventure visual novel type games. I play a lot of them, probably more than many people I know do. But that's a genre that I'm really, really into, and so I appreciated this. Although I do think, you know, we're talking about the accessibility of playing this. Like, I'm thinking of this in comparison to like Famicom Detective Club. That I think if you were to hand my mom Chicken Police, she would understand it, she would know how to play it, she would get it. If I handed her Famicom Detective Club, I don't think she would get it. I don't think she would understand it, even though the mechanics of it are very, very similar. Mm-hmm. I think that there's something here that makes it more accessible and more familiar because of the type of storytelling and because of the familiarity, rather than just being like animated characters and a story about a teenage detective.
Absolutely. So it's a combination of the narrative, the mechanics, fortunately, that makes it accessible. And like we have described, that they seized on the apparent limitations in order to have the few or the features that they have, having them done well, it allows for something enjoyable. In that sense, and this is not new, as you have described in your book. Across different moments in our industry, there have been constantly these limited resources that not only allow certain kinds of game, but even certain people, new people, to come into our industry. Do you think that this game is letting us know that a potential new audience, possibly, or new kinds of developers can enter into our industry, because this is showing that there's more accessibility, there are more kinds of games than what mainstream media sometimes shows?
Yeah, and I mean, we've got a lot of really, really solid titles that have come out, especially in the last decade, that are pretty accessible to people. You have things like What Remains of Edith Finch, you have Gone Home, things like that are really, really easy to pick up and play. They tell a story and then they're done. Like, you're not really having to stick in there, you're not having to spend a lot of time on it. And stuff like that has been really, really interesting for me to follow, especially because you do have the weird backlash against these types of games. But that's a whole other story. But I do think that there's an opportunity here for more people to get involved with playing games if there is that interest in making more accessible games for people generally.
Absolutely. To be aware that we are making games for someone to be played. Nevertheless, I remember the video essay by Charles. In your video essay, Charles, about Call of Duty, you mentioned that when games try to be for everyone, the other extreme, they end up being often for no one in particular. They become too diluted. In contrast, I believe with this game, with Chicken Police, they don't try to please everyone, even though it's more accessible. As we've heard, the team wanted to tell a very specific story. That was one of their design pillars, as Imre told us last time. So do you think that as a player, is it easier potentially for developers to find an audience by having the priority the story instead of the audience, paradoxically?
So I think what we're kind of discussing here is the idea almost of the auteur, where it's like, I'm going to tell the story that I want to tell, and it's going to appeal to whoever. And I think that it's all going to come down to what the story is. The example I often go to is Hideo Kojima. He made Metal Gear Solid, which has a lot of appeal to a lot of people, and it wound up being successful. And then he made Death Stranding, which is the most Kojima game ever made, and it was really mixed and polarizing because people didn't know what to do with it. I remember I was watching somebody on YouTube, and what he said was, I showed my girlfriend a trailer of Death Stranding, and I asked her, how would you play this game? What genre is this game? What do you think you do here? And the answer was, I don't know. I have no clue. And so you get a lot of games like that, where it's like, this is the game I want to make, and it's my vision. And people get it, and they're like, I have no idea what to do with this. And then you have other, you need that kind of balance of considering the audience, but also considering what you want to do. And so, like, one of the things that Chicken Police really reminds me of is Doki Doki Literature Club. It's also a visual novel, and it's telling a very specific story about a very specific thing. And it found an audience, and it was Dan Salvato just being weird in Renpai, and it worked really well. Or like Undertale, where you have a concept. It's kind of built around the whole Earthbound combat system, but with weird platforming and stuff like that. But it was a story Toby Fox really wanted to tell, and it found an audience. And so it's all going to come down, I think, to what it is you're telling. But people will always resonate with the same sorts of emotions. They're always going to... There's a really lazy trick in screenwriting, which is if you want people to be invested in your character, you create a love story. Don't do that. Don't ever follow that piece of it.
We're not fans of that in the show.
I have strong feelings about that. But at the same time, there are certain emotions that I think everybody can relate to. And in Doki Doki Literature Club, it starts out with a girl who she's dealing with depression. And, trying to hide it and trying to, live this normal life and working on how to deal with friends and with dating and things like that. And it results in a really dark twist that takes the game in a completely different direction. But I think that those sensations that, Dan Salvato is bringing across with Sayori are things that people can relate to. And that's really important. With Chicken Police, I think because it's a noir story that we've seen before, people can relate to this. Detective stories, I think, relate to people because we like a mystery. We like figuring things out. We like seeing how smart we are. And in this case, it's a consequence-free environment, and so we get to explore these ideas of, okay, maybe how clever am I,
Absolutely.
I think Charles picks up on something that's really at the heart of this, which is genre. As soon as you choose a genre, you have an audience. And actually, so from that perspective, like, yes, the story of Chicken Police is great, but pre-story, you know what it is exactly. We've got this. We know it's a kind of murder mystery, detective, film noir, and pretty point and click. Already there, you've got kind of 4 specific aspects, which is already pointing out your audience. With Death Stranding, you, as you say, it's like you look at it and you go, I don't know what the genre is here, and so that's really the device and function of genre. It's immediately saying, this is where I'm like hanging my hat, and you can expect certain things from saying what genre anything is in. You know, if you say horror genre, immediately there's certain things that come to your mind. You know that you're going to get probably kind of, you know, dark aesthetics, sinister music, jump scares. You know, you've already got those kinds of things, even just from the word horror. And so I think that's kind of the thing that I would say with kind of whether it's story first or audience first. Actually, as soon as you've got a genre, you've already got an audience. Whether the audience likes it,
it's another thing.
Question.
Yeah, or how
you know,
how competed that genre can be as well, and
yes,
discoverability.
absolutely. It doesn't mean it's going to be a success, but it means you know where you're trying to make it go, and that your audience looking at a trailer of it or just an image of it can immediately look at that and either, you know, become interested or dismiss it based on what they're a fan of.
Indeed.
Yeah. I think genre figures into it, but I also think there are a lot of really interesting examples, like for example, Papers, Please, where it's a paperwork processing simulator, but because it tells a really interesting and intriguing story, and because the gameplay figures into that, you know, it took something, and it's like kind of the Death Stranding approach of I have no idea what to do with this, I have no idea what this is, but people immediately sat down with it and they were like, oh, this is compelling, this is really interesting. You know, and so I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff that can be done with that. And, you know, it was a new medium for telling the story. And so, like, you know, that's why your theme and your narrative and your gameplay all figure into how this is going to resonate with people.
In that sense, since we all enjoy a lot, apparently, the narrative of this game, now that we can fortunately share spoilers all around, what do you think about the murder? What's going to happen to Sonny, to our characters? What do you feel about them?
I was really intrigued because in the last one, I still hadn't completed chapter 1 in our last discussion. So I actually had to go back today and watch like a let's play of which part chapter 2 was, because I was like, oh god, I can't remember what was the end of chapter 1, what was the start of chapter 2. And yeah, I think the more I play the game, the more I'm enjoying it. I think the different I think they work very well with the intrigue, the kind of... One of the things that I think is quite interesting is when you're moving around on the map, like sometimes that can be quite confusing when you're not entirely sure what you're looking for, but you know you're looking for something. But I guess, again, you know, that is putting you in the role of detective. You're like, oh, well, we haven't got many leads here, so we'll just go back and talk to the people.
Click everything.
Exactly. So I guess I'm very intrigued to find out more about Molly, Sonny's wife, and kind of what's gone on there. I think the kind of addition of the sort of royalist groups and the separatists, I'm quite interested to see where that goes, because it does feel like they've, in the kind of last chunk, they've added quite a lot, but I'm aware it's only 5 chapters long, and so I'm interested to see how much more it goes out before it starts coming in again as a story to kind of conclude. So yeah,
indeed,
I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
We're all very intrigued. And you want to share something? Go ahead.
I was gonna say that there's also the big mystery of like, who is Natasha? What is her backstory? Where did she come from? Why is she here? Like that whole edition is like, oh, interesting. It's giving me like weird Anastasia vibes.
That's also what I'm thinking. Yeah.
So the thing is, I haven't finished the game, but I'm approaching it from the perspective of what the genre is. When it comes to noir stories, like I said, I haven't finished the game. What I can tell you is that usually it's like a football game, and that the fourth quarter is the only one that matters. Everything else is a setup for that. And so it's noir stories are very much about the journey. They're about explorations of human experiences, and while the solving this murder is the setup for that, I feel like that's important to kind of keep in mind. Whenever it comes to movies or games or books about the sort of noir genre, it's always supposed to be an exploration of people are darker than we think they are. Certain people are, everybody has secrets. And that's what the genre is trying to do. And it just so happens that a murder mystery is a great way to set that up. And I think that Chicken Police is doing that really well. One of the big issues, though, when you have detective gameplay, that I think we've talked about before, is it's always really difficult because you have to balance what your player can reasonably expect to know versus what a detective would be called upon to do. I've played a couple of games that apparently expected the player to be an expert in blood spatter analysis and stuff like that. And I'm not really, I haven't even done a night class on that. So when you put me in that position...
If you've watched enough Dexter, then you can get all you need to know.
You hold up the little thing to the wall or whatever. And so that is kind of an example of where you don't want your detective game to go. But at the same time, you also have stuff like Batman Arkham Asylum, where you have the detective vision, which is basically you put on special glasses that go wheedly-wee, and you follow the little clues, and boom, all of a sudden it was the Joker. And so there's a balance in between there that you kind of have to find.
It was the Joker in a Batman thing? What?
I know, it's nuts. Spoilers.
What?
But,
I know.
But yeah, and so I think the visual novel style lends itself really well to this because the gameplay is in the questioning, and I think that LA Noire is a really good example of a game that kind of popularized that and made it more mainstream, the idea of deduction as gameplay.
Indeed, and in that sense, I recall what a colleague said some time ago. The screenwriter of True Detective. He said that while his show is about detectives, it was just a justification for him to have cool conversations and in interesting locations. So that is something else that I believe benefits a lot when we're getting to see an entirely new setting like we're seeing here in this game. We do have, thanks to the genre, some expectations. However, in no noir movie that I've seen so far, there are these royalist factions, like you were describing, Poppy, this Anastasia thing going on. It is quite probable that, like you were saying, Charles, it won't matter that much because this is just part of the setup in order to see the final how things get together. And maybe this is why the setting is so rich, because like you were saying, Poppy, perhaps in other mediums, in these graphic novels, we will get to see even more of this very rich setting that they are starting. I'm not sure if we will continue seeing some detective stories, potentially, but fortunately they are introducing the setting by also making use of detectives that are visiting and having to talk with all kinds of people that not every character could potentially access.
Yeah. One of the things I also want to clarify is just because something is not necessarily important to the overarching mystery doesn't mean that it's unimportant to the player or to what they might experience. The thing is, I basically, a little bit of background on me. I used to work as a screenwriter for a bit, and I also worked as a writing tutor. And whenever you're writing and you're putting things together, it's okay to take things in different perspectives, and you can do your world building as long as you're maintaining that narrative focus. And so whenever you are creating a world like this, where you have your royalists and your separatists, this is all world building and setup. And again, with the noir genre, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. And so I think that, it is a really interesting take on it. I don't know that it's as new of a take as it seems. Again, we're playing within an established genre using established tropes. And so, and this isn't a knock against Chicken Police. It's more the idea of taking what is familiar and making it unfamiliar for the purposes of intriguing your audience.
Indeed, and so far I am really intrigued. Again, I come back to the accessibility of this game. I'm very fortunate that even though I have terrible memory, I more or less can keep up with you experts. I finished episode 2 the very same Sunday that we had our original discussion. I was so hyped. And I was so surprised that episode 2, chapter 2, was not as long, at least for me, as chapter 1. So on our first conversation, we said that, oh, maybe it's too much having these summaries when we get a location, when Sunny is thinking and we get this narration. I am pretty sure that when we start episode 3, I will benefit a lot because it's been 2 weeks since I last played the game. You were very smart, Poppy, about watching a quick playthrough before our conversation.
And I also stopped myself at chapter 3 because then I was like, if I start playing chapter 3 again, I'll forget the the finitude of each section.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's interesting to see. I mean, I guess my assumption is that the kind of the main thrust of the story is going to turn out to be all about Molly, because I think also I feel awful that I don't know if she's a crocodile or an alligator. I feel like that's a big faux pas. But the matron of the place, which again I can't remember the name of that either. But she when they discover
of the brothel,
Marty,
right?
The Sweltering Nile, is that the name of it?
Sweltering Nile, exactly. Yeah. So when they discover Marty and Sunny in the secret back room, and he starts asking her, what's this got to do with Molly? She says herself, "Oh, look how quickly your professionalism goes as soon as you see, your ex-wife's or wife's name." And I think it's, as it is, I'm assuming that Molly is going to be a kind of much bigger part of the story, because I don't think we know, like, are they ex-wife and husband, or are they like separated? Is she dead?
Is she missing?
Exactly, like, who knows? And so I think that, in terms of what Charles is saying there about kind of which bits of the story matter and the murderer is the kind of way into this all, that I'm definitely intrigued to kind of find out more about that character, and see kind of where that goes. Yeah,
absolutely. You had some thoughts too, Anne, about the story?
Did I? I mean, generally, I guess I do, but I don't remember if I had anything particular. I do wonder, there has been, like, in the background of this whole time, this, like, under level of, like, animal racism that's been happening. And I'm wondering if that's at all going to become relevant, or if that's just, like, a set piece. Because it feels kind of, like, weird to just use this, like, actual real-life problem as a set piece. So I hope that they actually do something with that, as opposed to just, like, leaving it as it is and be like, oh, no bugs allowed here in this restaurant. Here's this guy who can't communicate with you. And then, there's the whole, like, hierarchy of animals that's going on. I do hope that they do something with that and don't just kind of, like, leave it there and throw it at you and hope that you forget that it exists, basically.
That's a good point. Personally, I believe that it will have something to do with the resolution or with the problem just before the climax. I was surprised when in the room where there was the murder, where the herald was dead, the very first woman we met, there was this small puzzle about opening a sort of safe. And I have terrible memory, yet I was able to solve that puzzle because I was very surprised when I saw the crest of this city. And I believe this crest has something to do with the hierarchy, like you were saying, Anne, of this society. There were naturally some predators, but if I recall correctly, there was also a crane. So there was a birth, I believe. So I was very surprised that there was a crane when I first saw the crest of the city. Naturally, because of that, I remembered and I tried doing the combination. And I surprised myself because on the very first try, I solved a puzzle that requires memory. But since we see that not only in conversations like you were saying with the fly, but in something of secrets and gameplay, that's so far making me feel that we'll see more of that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I haven't finished the game. I have an idea of how exactly I think this is going to play out. and I'm really hoping that it subverts my expectations. But it's one of those really interesting things where, again, it's about the journey, and there are times where it's good to be genre savvy, it's good to kind of know what's going on, and there are times where I feel like it can kind of undermine and hurt the story. Noir detective stories are kind of my thing.
Oh, really?
Which means that a lot of times I wind up looking at them and I can kind of call it from the beginning.
Sure.
Which is really unfortunate. It's a little bit like whenever you have a horror fan and the jump scares don't work because they're so desensitized to jump scares at this point. Also me. And so I think this is one case where you have a real sort of dilemma of, do you keep up with the tropes? Do you go ahead, go through the motions? Or do you go out on a limb and try something different? And I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer in this case.
Yeah, I get you. I get you. In that sense, for example, I'm the opposite. I believe benefit a lot because I don't watch too many detective or film noir stories, movies, games. So in that sense, I believe that's why I'm particularly enjoying this ride. It's very fresh to me. However, I read a paper very interesting about spoilers some time ago, and apparently, even though the worst case, someone may spoil you a story, someone may actually tell you what's going to happen. In that article, they were describing that people can still enjoy the experience a lot, but it is naturally a very different experience because now there is this sense of anticipation of, I know what's going to happen, but I wanted to see how they align the pieces so that it happens, and that is another type of enjoyment. They're making more use of the expectation. Maybe for people who are experts in the genre, they can also live that.
Yeah, I mean, as a film nerd, one of the things that a lot of people talk about is the second viewing. And that's almost an expectation with certain movies where it's like, okay, I'm going to watch this once. You watch it again and you start to pick up on all of the foreshadowing and all the subtle sort of thoughts on it.
Me with Parasite.
Yeah.
Oh man, watching that the second time, I was like, oh jeez.
I should watch it second time.
Yep.
It's a great
Watch
movie.
it second time.
I should. In that sense, it is an interesting challenge for our industry, going back to games, because very few players finish games. Especially, I was surprised when I saw that for story-driven games. Even for people who fortunately purchase the game, enjoy the game, recommend the game, very few actually finish the campaign. There was an article on Kotaku about that some time ago. And it is not a limitation, fortunately. I believe that is something very distinct in the case of games in contrast with movies. It is very hard, I believe, to say, oh, you absolutely have to watch that movie that I had to leave like half of it unwatched. It is very hard. But the expectation, I believe, is different for us in the games industry.
Yeah, I think there's also there's a kind of area within games analysis where there's an attempt to just sort of break games down in a very dry way. I've talked a lot before about how I hate numerical rating systems. Absolutely hate them. I think that they have very little value to anything. But a big part of why is because of this idea of trying to do objective analysis on a piece of media whose purpose is to entertain. Because it's never going to be objectively entertaining. Entertainment is an inherently subjective thing. You can show two people the exact same thing and they'll have very different reactions. I hate Citizen Kane. I think it's an awful movie. I think it's very poorly written and very poorly made. But if I say that around film nerds, I'm going to start an argument. And the reason why is because they saw something I didn't. And, there's this idea, I think, that, there are a certain group of people that I think even wants to boil games down into, well, I paid this much money and got this much gameplay, and therefore this game was a better value than that game, completely ignoring the subjective qualities of it. And I think that really there needs to be this acknowledgement that inherently games criticism and games analysis is a subjective thing. And that we need to stop kind of gamifying it and trying to create this attitude of this game is objectively good, this game is objectively bad. We can talk about the metrics we use, but those metrics are always going to be personal to us.
Absolutely. In that sense, I sometimes feel the game industry very similar to the wine industry, the coffee industry, where you will have experts who will taste something, but most experts, like they really know their stuff, they will say it varies for your palate. Each of us has a very different palate. It doesn't matter that this wine or this game may have X amount of content or years. It all depends if you like it. And still, my girlfriend is connoisseur about these topics on mezcal. She says, but there are some objective elements that can help you to make a decision. In the case of games, for example, like we were saying, the genre. I believe the genre helps a lot to make just a purchasing decision, because it allows you to say, okay, I may enjoy in general this type of games. I know that I am getting into this experience. If this experience has some surprise in it, or it just follows the formula, that's an entirely different thing. And I wonder what will happen with this game. Will it continue down the formula in the terms of the narrative, or will it try to do something, because they have already taken some good bets, like this half, I don't know, head being of the animals. For example, I could imagine that they could play something as well with the predator-prey relationships. That has been hinted before. That is something that can be used in a very, I don't know, interesting way, especially with the wife that we haven't seen yet. That is at least part of my expectation.
Yeah, it's really difficult to write a mystery because you don't want it to be obvious to the audience, but at the same time, you don't want... One of the things I hate is whenever people say this mystery subverts expectations, because it introduces a character like in Act 3 that has had no bearing on the story whatsoever. We've never met them, and it turns out they were actually the person responsible for it. I
agree.
And don't murder me. It's one of my big problems with anime, is the idea of we've set up this whole big villain, and then at the end, it's actually this weird sort of deity that's existed for thousands of years that we now have to defeat with the power of friendship. And we've never really talked about this before, but just kind of go with it.
It's okay, you can say Persona.
Well, no, I know you won't murder me for trash talking Persona, but meanwhile, you've also got other things where it's like, oh, it's obviously that guy because he's the dude with the mustache. So we've got, all the people in... Listen, you laugh, it's always the guy with the mustache. But,
or the person who's, like, not as like, traditionally attractive as everybody else. Like, oh, that's definitely the villain. It's like, like, they have a different hair color.
Right. Sitting down watching The Matrix, you see Cypher, and you're like, oh, he's going to betray him. Done. Because he's got the look. And
the mustache.
And
yeah.
Well, and don't stress too much about the fact that I look like Cypher. I will not betray you guys. But it is very important to create in a mystery that you want to subvert expectations, but not in a way that's going to harm your narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's better that the audience say, oh, I knew it was going to be that guy, than that they're like, what's happening? I had to sneeze. Anyway, what's happening, or what's going on?
The Persona developers are thinking about you at this moment, Charles.
They're Atlas. They're thinking about me with nothing but disdain and disgust.
Yeah.
And that's they do with all other human beings.
Yeah. The only thing that they care about is the money. I say as somebody who, like, Persona 3 is like one of my favorite games of all time.
Oh my god, hot takes all around. Hot takes all around.
I'm a Persona 2 guy, personally, but yeah.
Me too.
In that sense, I recall a lot something that struck me about screenwriting in general, that an enjoyable twist is something that at the same time has to be surprising, yet in retrospective was unavoidable. That is so hard. That is one of the achievements, I believe, of writing. So I can't say that I have achieved it, but a tip, if there are any potential writers, is that you can find a real civilization that, like Mexico, has no budget. So there are no movies, and there are no stories, and there are no things that will solve the mystery for people. I believe that sometimes by trying to address new settings by itself helps a lot in order to build mysteries. Even though the genre may be familiar, the setting is something very surprising that can help us. So I look forward to seeing in our game this familiar city, but with the layer of the royalists versus I don't know what was the other faction? Republicans? No, what would be?
I think they're the separatists.
Separatists.
Yeah, separatists.
Yeah, separatists. Yeah. I want to see what they do with that, because oh my god, it is so hard to mess that up. I hope that in this sense, I hope that they cling to convention and it's not something like join the resistance, please no. Yeah, I believe
it's one of the things that I think I was just thinking about what Anne was saying with the racism and, you know, the potential of the racism being kind of brought into the royalist separatist kind of storyline there. But I think Anne made a really good point, which is that, you know, obviously racism is a huge real life issue that's incredibly serious and literally costs lives. But I don't, that should never be a sentence that's followed with but. I'm talking about but in relation to the game. I wonder if actually, I think, you know, Anne was saying you thought that it would be weird to kind of not then do more with that because it's so serious. But I suppose I'm wondering whether actually there's something quite compelling about doing something with it that doesn't solve it, that doesn't...
I don't think they're going to solve it.
Well, no, but I mean, I think that it will be interesting, as you say, to kind of see how they use that, but in a way that doesn't then kind of go, oh, and, you know, now we've got tofu, we can all live happily ever after, which, you know, they do have these meat substitutes. But I think that's quite an interesting aspect of the racism within the gameplay and what function we need those real life issues to serve within the context of the game space. Obviously there's a lot of video games that deal with racism, and there are a lot of video games that are racist, and so I think any video game that kind of highlights issues of racism in ways that are, you know, apparent for the audiences to again have that kind of level of being able to consider a serious issue through a different medium. I think that's a very positive step. But equally, as you know, as Anne said, like they're not going to be able to solve it, and I hope they don't solve it, because if they did, that would be really reductionist to the whole concept.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Here's the thing that's important to remember about the noir sort of genre is you're not going to come out of this with a good guy and a bad guy. No. You're not going to come out of this with any sort of resolution beyond who did the murder, and that's very much a hallmark of that genre, because the whole idea is, again, exposing people for who and what they are, which is, you know, as Men in Black put it, a person is smart, people are panicky, they're cowardly, and they don't know what to do. And so that's what I think we can expect more of, is here's what happens when you're put in the unfortunate situation of being a murder suspect and the police are questioning you, and you're not going to come out of this looking good. No one, I think, in this game is going to come out looking good if they stick to the noir tropes. And
I personally would, if there was a happy ending to Chicken Police, I would be disappointed, because that's not what I'm there for. I don't want, you know, Sonny and Molly to get back together and have little chicks.
Poor Sonny.
Great, yeah. But I suppose, like I say, I mean, it's interesting to think about that in the context of, as you say, the murder, the royalists, the separatists, Molly, Marty, Sonny, their kind of relationships. But in the context of how it's then using racism as a backdrop to the story, the city, the history of the game world, I think, you know, does it need to do more than that in terms of the racism within the game? Does it need to do more than just have it there? Because I think having it there is a really big deal. I think it's really, as I say, important. I think it serves a really important purpose. And so Yeah, it's because it's very difficult, isn't it? When you have games that have those serious elements. I always think that, you know, the phrase that I hate the worst is serious games. Like serious games, the idea of serious games makes me shudder, because you know, all games have serious elements to them, whether that's the, you know, seriousness of making friends online or expressing your creativity, or more important things like teaching you specific skills. Well, not more important things, sorry, more explicit things. But I suppose, you know, in this context as well, with that kind of racial backdrop, it's an incredibly important issue that they've brought up. I think they do it quite well in terms of both. Mm-hmm. So far, yes, in terms of both how that has. It's both implicit and explicit. There's some really interesting aspects of dialogue where those kind of racial connotations are obviously meant in sort of quite jokey and, you know, passable ways, and then there's other interactions where it's like, how dare you say that about me, and there's obviously, you know, some kind of line there, both in terms of the words used, the expectations of characters, the way different characters are portrayed. Sorry, so that was just a bit of a kind of ramble there about.
No worries.
I suppose I'm interested in.
I believe seriously
so
that this is the best way in order to improve our industry. Like I have talked with each of you guys, to really have this place where we can share our ideas, because we, so far as an industry, we have lacked this safe place to ramble, to ask our questions, to share our hot takes, and that's absolutely necessary in order to, perhaps there is an incomplete thought, or there is that part of an idea, but someone else finds something that resonates with them. For example, myself, that I am dealing with, as you know, post-colonialism and colonial history, which is also a really current topic. You have given me a lot of ideas and questions that in my work I will continue developing. So I believe we're all hyped for what comes next. We're already making our theories, and we can comment that on our next episode. As always, on the show notes you can find links to the very interesting things that our guests are doing and games. So see you guys